When it comes to the treatment side of things, we are focusing on our larger trees that have a lot of value, that are in communities that, where we need to be preserving tree canopies, as well as areas where we are working on canopy cover goals. The goal really is not to treat every single tree, but those trees that are smaller than probably 6 or 8 inches, just get rid of them. By the time that you have spent money treating those for a lifetime of the tree, the benefits, right, aren't necessarily worth it. The last point before I talk about the couple of treatment options that we really have is that we are not reinventing the wheel here. So the beautiful thing, Wyatt sort of talked about it, but the beautiful thing about all of what we're dealing with EAB is it stinks that it's here. This is not great, but the Midwest and the East Coast have been dealing with this pest for over 20 years. So we have tons and tons and tons of data. The people who are working on the riparian side of things, Godspeed to y'all. Thank you for what you're doing, because that is sort of the uncharted territory. But from my perspective and where I work in the realm of things in the urban forestry world, we have very good solutions that are very safe environmentally, which Andy is going to talk about, that are efficacious and not that expensive and not that hard to do. We have 3 different treatment options available to us that the state, Oregon Department of Agriculture, has on their suitable list, approved pesticide list. So they come down to 3 active ingredients. Imidacloprid is one of our soil applied options. It is a neonicotinoid, but it is very, very, very cheap. We're going to hear about the pollinator concerns with neonicotinoids. That lasts for 1 full year, and that's an application that you want to get in the fall or the early spring, because it does take a little bit of a while to get into the tree. It takes about 3 months to get into the canopy of the tree. We want to make sure that that insecticide is in the canopy, moving up through the vascular tissue of that tree while those pests are actively feeding. So that's that. Dimethoprim is the other neonicotinoid that's available. That you can do via soil application or bark spray. Very easy, very fast. That chemistry is slightly more expensive. It's done annually, but it is, again, very fast. You can do it as a bark spray where you can just move very quickly. You're spraying from 6 feet down to the ground. Goes really fast if you want one of those little backpack sprayers. And then our last option, really our most efficacious, our non-neonicotinoid option, the option that we are going to be recommending mostly across the board out here, is our trunk injection option. So it's done via microinjection. We've got some systems if you want to look at them. If you don't know what that is, for any of my non-practicing arborists. And then that is emamectin benzoate. So emamectin benzoate, we've been hearing all about it. It lasts for 2, potentially 3, or even more years, depending on what sort of sites you're looking at. If you're looking at like homeowners that have really valuable, 35-inch Oregon oak, you're going to want to treat those every 2 years. You can spread that out a little bit further for your budgetary reasons. Go to 3 years, stage them in conjunction with one another. Basically, highly, highly efficacious, 99% efficacious if you can get to treating the trees if they have less than 30% dieback. Thanks for letting me bring that up. There's a few studies that have been done. Obviously, there is an impact no matter what we do, no matter what we put into the environment, there is an environmental impact. Generally speaking, there can be impacts, like if there are insects and things, obviously it won't kill anything in there, which I think, you kind of mentioned that. The half-life on things as far as like breaking down though, it does break down relatively quickly as far as, over a period of time, but it will definitely kill stuff. It will kill things in the soil. Emamectin benzoate though breaks down very, very quickly, and that is the product that most folks are going to be leaning towards.
So thank you guys for having me. So we're going to talk a lot about treatment options, saving ashes, but I want to approach this more from a worker safety point of view. So with working on these dead and dying ash trees, this is part of the reason that we've had such a mechanization in tree work, especially up in the Midwest and the East Coast, is because these trees are very dangerous to work on. So they do spread some decay pathogen that significantly weakens woods. It's probably multiple decay pathogens, and definitely not the right person to talk about that. But there's whole tree failure, big branches that are failing from these trees under relatively low loads. So we're talking 12-inch diameter tie-in points breaking out. So these trees can become very unsafe to remove once they die. So during the dying process with EAB, we experience a lot of strength loss. And that would be from felling the tree to climbing the tree. So if you have the ability to, best practice is to not climb the tree at all once it's dead, and get some form of lift, a crane, what have you. You can talk to most of the commercial arborists in the room. They can tell you a lot about different options for removing really sketchy trees. But the main thing with working on these trees, if we have a tree that we know that we're not going to treat, that we're not going to save, that's in an area that's inaccessible for any of these mechanized pieces of equipment, the best thing to do would be to remove it now and then replant with something while it's not sketchy to climb. With the detection of EAB, it's really tough to find those little D-shaped exit holes. So you're going to notice general decline in the canopy, and then followed by whole branch and stem death. We were actually just on a project removing several emerald ash borer dying trees in Forest Grove, and a lot of the trees, the canopies looked awesome last year. And then this year, as they're leafing out, there was probably, maybe 50% defoliation. These insects are flying around like they're everywhere. So when I left that site on Tuesday, I walked around my car and I picked off probably 15 adult emerald ash borers off of my car. So these are going to be spreading. We are going to be seeing them in our various places of work, probably quicker than we'd like. So that's all that I've got. So thank you guys. As long as we're using proper disposal techniques, chipping all the wood that we can, solarizing the wood, doing something to try to destroy the adult populations that are there. I'm not sure if there's a whole lot of danger to that, but definitely trying to shift some of that work into the dormant period, where we're probably not going to be transmitting, flying adults around. Dead ash, they get pretty sketchy pretty quick. And the thing with waterways and creekways is it's not the structure of the wood that we need there. We need the shade to not heat our waterways up. So that's kind of the biggest thing with the loss of our ashes. It's not really the home for critters. It's shading everything.
In my experience in the Midwest, it really depended on the pressure of the pest. So in areas of high pressure, like Logan is indicating here on a Forest Grove, really within the course of a season, you can see a pretty big progression. In areas where you're kind of on the periphery, it may take a year or a couple of years to go from sort of like decent canopy to 20-30% dieback. So it can take a couple of years, but really it just depends. You've all seen that picture of the exponential death curve, I'm sure, hopefully. That's really the biggest indicator of how fast they'll go. Operationally speaking, for you, any of the actual production arborists out there, or anybody who's gonna have crews doing removals, do an inspection pretty close to when you're gonna have to be performing the work, and make sure that you alert your, whether landowner, homeowner, whoever, that your price could go from being a nice, easy flopper to we need to have a crane and do all this stuff pretty quickly.
Decision about ash tree treatment or removal is influenced by 3 key factors: city goals and priorities, policies and practices, and of course staff capacity and budget. So the City of Portland has a lot of goals and priorities that are relevant to our approach to treatment versus removal. So things like climate change resilience, urban forest preservation and expansion, public health, equity, and invasive species mitigation. So these goals really push us towards leaning treatment over removal because treatment preserves existing canopy and the many benefits and services that that canopy provides for as long as possible. Our public health and equity priorities sort of lean us towards evaluating our management decisions so that we're not exacerbating existing inequities in canopy distribution or public health, and also aren't disproportionately burdening underserved or low-income communities. So there's also a lot of city policies and practices that are influencing the way that we would respond to EAB or decide to treat or remove. So there's a few that I just wanted to highlight. We have Title 11, the city's tree code, which is the way that we regulate and manage trees, and that is different depending on where the trees are growing, tree size, and a host of other factors. And so as part of the tree code, we have a replacement tree planting requirement so that we can meet our canopy goals. So when we're thinking about those costs about treatment or removal, anytime we think about removal, we're really thinking about removal and replacement. And those costs can really add up, as we have seen. Also, because the city doesn't currently maintain street trees, we also can't easily incorporate a treatment or removal program into our street tree maintenance program. And this is quite different from a lot of other cities in the Midwest and East Coast that have been dealing with EAB. So it's something that we're really thinking thoroughly about as we think about our response. Also, the city of Portland has banned the use of neonics on city property, so we certainly won't be using any of the treatment options that Allison mentioned that fall into that category. That's so we can protect our pollinators, and that's something we also will be encouraging others to do as well. And then we're working with our integrated pest management program to think through, what are the impacts to non-target species in addition to pollinators, and also what's the appropriate management strategy for different land uses? Is it appropriate to treat and remove trees the same way in developed parks as we would in natural areas? So those are things we're currently thinking through. And then last, I just want to mention that Portland Parks and Rec has a really great equity and anti-racism lens, which is something that we're actively using as we think about our response strategy to consider the impacts of our decisions on different communities. So how we're applying this to our treatment or removal strategy is thinking about where are the ash trees growing, who lives near them, who benefits from those trees, and who would be most impacted if they were removed. We're also thinking about who's responsible for maintaining those trees, and are there things the city can do to minimize those impacts that might disproportionately burden some of those communities who live near that canopy and rely on it. Next is thinking about staff capacity and budget, and how we decide to treat or remove trees, and when we make those decisions about treating versus removing. So as part of this evaluation, we've done a lot of cost analyses of different scenarios, so doing similar tools to what you've already seen, thinking about the cost of removing and replacing all ash trees, thinking about treating most ash trees in developed parks, or treating some street trees in low canopy areas, just a variety of different scenarios. And no matter which way you look at it, the results are pretty clear. And this matches what we've already heard today, is that tree removal, proper wood disposal, and replanting is really labor intensive and expensive. So if you were to ask, if you're a city or agency and you just want to say, hey, tree crew, can you just remove and replace 400 additional trees in a year or two, and then the time we have to respond to EAB, most cities are not going to have staff that can respond to that. So that's something that's really important to think about. Treatment, on the other hand, as Allison alluded to, it's much quicker to do, and also a lot lower cost to implement, especially when you're comparing it to removal, replacement, and proper wood disposal. Something else that I think is really important to mention is that treatment really can be used to distribute that removal, disposal, and replanting costs over a longer time period that we would likely have to deal with all of those removal and replacements if we didn't treat at all. So the key takeaway is that treatment can really buy you time to manage EAB in a way that matches your staff capacity and your budget without compromising public safety, arborist safety, or canopy loss. Okay. Well, I'll just say we're still working on our strategy at the City of Portland, but I'm happy to talk and answer more questions about the ways that we're thinking about applying it. Urban Forestry is working very closely with broader Portland Parks, also Bureau of Environmental Services, also speaking with other agencies in the region about education and outreach, because I think that is one of our most powerful tools aside from treatment, is just educating the public and other landowners. So we're certainly working closely with other divisions to think about what can we do together. We're definitely looking at how many of those developed parks with ash trees or a higher concentration of ash trees are in our identified priority planting areas, which are areas of the city that are lower income and have lower canopy. So we're certainly putting those trees at the top of our priority list for preservation because those trees are very important to those communities. We want to preserve canopy in those areas as much as we can, but we also have tree planting programs within urban forestry and the Bureau of Environmental Services. And in our program, we have a street tree program, and we specifically target new plantings in areas that are our priority areas. So low income, low canopy areas. So both preservation and wanting to plant new plants.
I want to do two things today. The first is get yourself to wrap your head around how risk to pollinating insects occurs, and then I want to do a brief review of what at least I know of the risks associated with insecticide treatments to protect ash or to pollinating insects. So to begin with, we all know that the risk of something is not only the toxicity of the insecticide, but the likelihood of exposure. All the products that we've talked about today, if you look at the environmental hazard sections of the pesticide label, they will be listed as highly toxic or toxic to bees. So that's just one part of the equation. There is the likelihood of exposure. With pollinating insects, there's really kind of two things to keep in mind. With butterflies and moths, it's whether their caterpillars feed on ash. Because ash flowers do not provide nectar, there's no risk of nectar going into butterflies or moths. And with bees, it's whether they collect, whether there's toxic residues in the pollen. So they will collect the pollen off the flowers. What we know when it comes to butterflies and moths is there's a handful of butterflies whose caterpillars will feed on ash. And there's maybe a dozen or so species that have been associated with eating leaves of ash trees. It's not a huge portion of the butterfly and moth fauna. It's not a big heavy hitter when it comes to those communities. Nevertheless, there is none of the butterflies and moths that I was able to find are either threatened or endangered. So that brings us around to the bees and the risk of insecticide finding its way into the pollen and the bees collecting it. Now, there have been only a few studies looking at that I was able to find, and there's more out east that I just wasn't able to access. So when it comes to emamectin benzoate, there have been studies. There's a study in Colorado where they looked at both soil and tree injections, and the amounts that are found in the pollen, in a spring application, the amounts that are found in the pollen are not of levels to be concerned to bees. They're very low in concentration. I was unable to find studies looking at imidacloprid specifically, but a couple things to mention about it. So people have been looking at imidacloprid on trees for years, and you can remember the big incident that we had that arborists know about in the state, the linden tree incident, where treatments were applied months before there was, deaths to the bumblebees. And so we know with imidacloprid it doesn't reside in trees for a long period of time. Studies that have been done on imidacloprid and bees are mixed. So some studies have shown, all of them show that there's some kind of long residual. But still, there's, so 8 to 10 months before the tree comes into bloom is generally regarded as a safe period. But the studies are mixed on this. Some studies have like fall applications with no measurable residues in the flowers. And some show, like when you start to push the treatments out into the fall, there are measurable residues that are problematic. So it's a little bit mixed, and it likely it's a product of the rate, the tree species, and the environmental conditions. But the one thing I do want to put on the table here, and maybe just to kind of put things into focus, is how important is ash pollen to bee communities? And there have been studies in Ohio, there have been studies in Colorado, and it shows that the amount of pollen being collected by bees from ash tends to be relatively low. And I suspect in Western Oregon it's even lower. You can think of the competition for bees at that time of year, April, when those flowers come into bloom. There's willow, there's maple, there's all sorts of flowering shrubs. And although we don't have an estimate of how much pollen is coming in, my sense is it's going to be relatively low. It'd be worth looking into this. The last thing I want to mention is there have been studies to look at bee communities with lots of trees that have been treated with imidacloprid, ash trees treated with imidacloprid, and lots that haven't. And there does not seem to be any impact on the abundance of bees in those communities. So long and short of it is, I think the issue that's on the table is imidacloprid as a soil treatment, or diateperin as a treatment on the bark of the soil. And my sense is that the risks probably are relatively low. And as arborists, the important thing to keep in mind is that when you're doing soil drench applications, to make sure it's not, in that zone where the drench is being applied, there isn't a highly bee-attractive plant growing, because it will take it up, and that's where I think the big risks will occur. Thank you. My sense is that when I think about the spring fauna, the spring bees, the rare bees we have, they are really targeting willow and maple. Like those are the two tree species that most bees go to. I think it's worth looking into to see if, looking at some of the loads of a species like Osmia or mason bees and seeing if they're. But actually, people have gone through mason bee as a kind of a surrogate for a solitary bee. And it is, there's been studies up in Seattle, and there's been studies down in California as well. It's willow heavy. They really love willow. So my sense is that we have so much blooming early on. There's two issues. We have these urban trees, which have, there's clearly an insect community around these urban trees. But we have, likely, when I'm talking about butterflies and moths, we're talking about wild ash and those wild ash communities. But still, I kind of want to, keep it out of the wild ash populations as much as possible. So if it means going heavier in urban areas, so be it. The studies that have been done with honeybees specifically, you see some ash pollen coming in, but it's really overloaded with all the other spring sources of pollen. So one doesn't, you can sort of track bees, but it's kind of hard to do. So my sense is what you described is going on. There are much more attractive sources of pollen and nectar at that time of year. Because we're talking about bloom starting in April, finishing off around that May 1st period where treatment should be going on. And so most of the flowering is done anyways at that point. So I say that May 1st treatment period really the risk gets really, really low at that point because there's a full year for those residues to dissipate.
Specifically with ammonite benzoate, which again is the preferred thing, and I think this is one of the reasons, we treat after flower. So we treat once the ash flower pretty early, then we treat during full leaf out. So they're pretty much done flowering. They're done flowering by the time we go into treat. And then, the studies, I think, show after about, 10 months, it starts to wane in that plant part. But then the thing with ammonite benzoate is we're doing that for 2 or 3 years, and what we see is it actually doesn't move into the new leaves or the new flowers or flower parts pollen in very high. If it does, it's very, very, very low. So again, it's that frequency component of toxicity. It is with unprotected benzoate actually quite low for multiple, chemistry reasons.
Yeah, from what I'm really keen next year to go out and trap some pollen in Oregon, just to at least to kind of nail that question down for the state. I think both the public, conservationists, beekeepers would just feel a lot better to know that this, the risk is relatively low. I think if you go into Oregon flora, there's a really great appendix in Oregon flora at the back with butterfly host plant associations. I think there's 2 butterflies that have associations with ash. It's a low number. Ash is such a predominant part of riparian areas that inevitably there are insect communities tied deeply to those, to the ash. Maybe not even directly to the ash, but to the plant community that the ash anchors down. And my sense is that there's going to be some impacts.